Tonight we have the special privilege and treat of welcoming our board member Kaleb Schrock as our presenter. Kaleb was originally from Waverly. Everly's a little closer, and grew up loving history. His grandpa would frequently take him to the Grout Museum in Waterloo for history-centered events. When he was 14, he caught the bug and began reenacting. He joined the 3rd Iowa Light Artillery for Civil War reenactments, and around the same time he got involved in early 1800s mountain men reenacting. Kaleb came to study Spanish and marketing at Northwestern College, where he met his wife, Kathleen. He and Kathleen enjoyed hiking, camping, and traveling around the world. And they are also the proud parents of 2 twin daughters who are about 2 years old right now. So I think that keeps somebody busy. Kaleb presented a program here at our museum about 2 years ago, concentrating on fur traders, mountain men, and how they shaped the West as we know it. In the past couple of years, he researched and immersed himself more into Civil War reenacting, this time in the infantry. He also conducted more early 1800s mountain men reenacting, which has ranged from public events to private period trapping and hiking trips, all in 1800 and 1840s clothing. Now, thinking about Kaleb and his mountain man experience, it reminded me of myself just a little while ago. I recently went to the doctor for an annual checkup, and after all the blood tests and coughing and thumping and all the tests you can imagine, he said he thought I was in pretty good shape for a man of my age. How many of you like to hear that? Well, anyway, I told him that didn't surprise me at all. I'd just been the other day, I'd trudged over 5 miles through the woods, over some steep hills, through a few thistle patches, and even got sand in my eyes before I ended up in the water. He was quite impressed and told me that I must be quite an outdoorsman. And I had to admit that really I'm not such a great outdoorsman. I'm just a very poor golfer. Well, I think Kaleb is going to be a real treat for the rest of us tonight as he takes us back to the Civil War era. He's got an authentic uniform, and he provides an immersive look into the Dutch-American experience during the Civil War. Kaleb, who participates in reenactments with the 4th and 24th Iowa Infantry, will offer a fascinating glimpse into the daily lives of many Iowa volunteers, shedding light on the realities of the survival in the American Civil War. So Kaleb, let's have you come on out.
There we go. Can you hear me well now? All right. Well, first I'd like to start by saying thank you to everyone for making it out tonight. It means a lot to all of us here at the museum. This many people were able to show up. This museum means a lot to me and the people here, so we love to see the participation from the community. A little bit more about me. So the Civil War to me is something that, a lot of people can see as far away 160 years ago. What does it matter to us today? For me, the Civil War is a good example of what happens when public discourse takes its most ugliest turn. I think it's very glaring today in our current political age that it is important that we find those common grounds in ability to talk through our problems. The Civil War is an example of what happens when those problems get to such an extent that it has to be decided with guns. So for me, studying the Civil War is kind of like a look into what lessons can we learn from the past in ways that we can better our future. So with that, I would like to get into a little bit more niche topic within the Civil War, and that being the Dutch Americans during the Civil War. Now, Orange City may not have been founded during the time of our nation's Civil War, but a lot of the early settlers to Orange City were veterans. Now, one of those was Marinus Reinsberger, who served in the 15th Iowa Volunteer Infantry. And I would like to tell you a little bit about his first battle. That being the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. The regiment, arriving at Pittsburgh Landing on the morning of April 6, 1862, in his official report, Colonel Reed stated that upon reaching Pittsburgh's Landing, he proceeded at once to General Prentiss and found that officer in a division under his command already under fire of the enemy. Colonel Reed was ordered to bring his regiment forward at once. He at once rode back to the landing and ordered his regiment off the boats. As fast as the men reached their shore, they were handed their rifles, handed ammunition, and were ordered to load their guns for the first time. Up to this point, these men had only practiced with sticks and basic marching drills. So they had the ideas of how to load, but had yet to actually do it with a real firearm. But the war was upon them. At this time, an order was given by General Grant's staff that directed them to hold this position, preventing stragglers from reaching the shoreline. The regiment remained in this position for about an hour, when an order came for the regiment to advance in support of General McClernand, some 2 miles to the front. The 16th Iowa was included in this order, and the two regiments bravely marched forward. A great many soldiers were met during this, running from the battle undertaking in front of them, with the roar of battle in front showing the desperate conflict that was in progress. These men slowly marched as the wounded and stragglers ran behind them, getting closer and closer to the musketry and cannonades firing in their front. It makes you think how someone who could have never even loaded his rifle before is able to stand firm under those circumstances. It would take the utmost courage of these men who were fresh from their homes, fresh from their farms, unused to the dreadful scenes transpiring about them, with the boom of cannon and the crash of musketry sounding near each step, and with the panic-stricken and the wounded racing past them as they advance, they pressed steadily forward. The following extract I have here is from Colonel Reed's official report discussing how his regiment conducted itself during their first engagement. Quote, "Our flagstaff was shot through and our colors riddled with bullets. For 2 hours from 10 to 12 o'clock, we maintained our position, our men fighting like veterans. I was severely wounded by a musket ball through the neck, which knocked me from my horse and paralyzed me for a time. But I was able to recover, remounted my horse, and proceeded to continue the command during the fight. 15 of the 32 commissioned officers who went on the field have been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. 22 officers and men have been killed, and 156 wounded. The enemy were attempting to outflank us on the right as well as the left. We were unsupported by artillery or any other regiment besides that of the gallant 16th, which had also suffered severely in the course of the battle. It became necessary for the two regiments to retreat or run the risk of being captured." End quote. Of those wounded was Corporal Marinus Reinsberger of Pella, Iowa, later Orange City resident. He would survive his wounds and serve for the remainder of the war with the 15th Iowa. That raises a good question. What would motivate these men to leave their farms, leave their homes, leave their communities that they knew dear and held dear, to put themselves into such a situation? Especially men who were recent immigrants to this nation. They had much more ties to their local Dutch communities than they did to the nation as a whole. So to answer that, today I would like to talk more about the Dutch living in the United States in 1861, as well as focusing more on Iowa and Iowan Dutch involvements. So the Dutch Americans in the United States. According to the census of 1860, about 30,000 born in the Netherlands Dutch were in the United States at the time. And of those, an estimated number of 600 to 700 Dutch served for either side during the American Civil War. Now, this number does not account for people of Dutch descent. This number only accounts for those who were born in the Netherlands and have immigrated during the last 20 years leading up to the Civil War. So these would be your Pella immigrants arriving in the 1840s. Now, there has to be a notable distinction when we talk about the Dutch in the Civil War. Because during the 1860s, the word Dutch became a catch-all word for Germans as well. This came from a mispronunciation of the German word Deutsch, meaning German, so many Germans and German speakers would have been called Dutchmen. So if any of you decide to find this topic very interesting and start looking up, Dutchmen of the American Civil War, you'll find a lot of results, but you have to be a little picky because you'll get a lot of interesting things about German Americans during the American Civil War, who were also called Dutch at this time. Now, going off of that, there was never enough Dutch soldiers to form full Dutch regiments or brigades like the Germans and the Irish. But there were Dutch companies that had a majority Dutch speakers. Now, the largest of the Dutch communities in the United States at this time were in Michigan and Iowa, with some scattering settlements throughout the Midwest. These were the colonies of Holland and Pella, where the Dutch community was maintained, but a strong majority of them still only speaking Dutch with little to no English. At the time, they didn't see themselves as Dutch Americans as many see themselves today. They saw themselves as Dutch citizens living in America. There's a distinction there that'll come up later. As a result, they had limited interest in the overall politics of the day. As a result, they saw things like slavery, while majority saw it as something immoral. At best, they saw it as something that will go away on its own, or is best to just left alone and kept where it's at right now. Or at worst, they saw it as just a necessary evil. Either way, it was something far away from their local community and not something that they really cared about. Now, that's not to say there were ardent abolitionists among the Dutch. There were, but I'm generalizing a bit here talking about the Dutch community as a whole. The majority of Dutch, on average, supported the Democratic Party leading up to and during the American Civil War, despite the slavery slant that that party had. There were many reasons behind their support for the Democratic Party, but one of the major ones was the Republican Party of this time had a lot of members of pre-Civil War nativist parties. Now, these were parties who were very anti-immigrant and very nativist, native-born Americans. As a result, many Dutch picked up on this and saw these members flocking to the Republican Party and preferred the Democratic Party that had more favorable immigrant policies. Now, that actually led them to, in the 1860 election, to vote overwhelmingly against Abraham Lincoln. They saw voting Democrat at that time as their best way to avoid a civil war. During the second election during the Civil War of 1864, the Dutch again overwhelmingly voted against Abraham Lincoln, supporting General George McClellan's Democratic Party, seeing him as his solution of negotiated peace with the South as the best way to end the war as quickly as possible and return life to normal. So listing all of that raises another good question. Why serve then? Why, if these people were so not wanting to be involved in this war, why did the ones who did serve? So as the war drew closer, many prominent preachers, the Dutch Reformed Church as a whole in this area, as well as prominent citizens such as Henry Schulte of Pella and Albertus van Raalte of Holland. I practice a lot these Dutch names, so I tried my best to get the... Many of them became Republicans, abolitionists, and strongly anti-secessionists. They convinced many young men that preserving the Union was a noble goal and something that they should strive towards. So many joined these because of these orders and the tight-knit community they were from. Part of it was volunteering by themselves or letting themselves be drafted would mean being assigned to a random company with random people that they may or may not know. They may be from the same county, but they were not from that same Dutch community that they were part of. So many who joined tried to join together. That's where you get some companies like Company I of the 25th Michigan and Company G of the 33rd Iowa having a majority Dutch members because they all joined together with the idea being, I don't want to leave my best friend or my cousin, et cetera, et cetera. Another motivation for volunteering for some of these soldiers was it would help meet the quota for their county. That meant that my younger brother no longer has to be drafted if I go and fill his place. Some of the other reasons are pretty common for other soldiers in many of the wars is young men seeking adventure, and the opportunity to see the world and get out of that tight-knit community that they were a part of for so long. Opportunity to spread their wings, so to speak. But that doesn't mean everyone, as we've talked about, was the ardent volunteer. And many chose not to, either refusing to accept the draft, arguing that they're not American citizens, they're Dutch citizens, therefore they did not qualify to be drafted. And others fled to Canada during the war and then returned afterwards so as to avoid being drafted as well. So throughout the war, there were too few Dutch to ever form a full regiment of Dutch, like you'd have like the Irish Brigade, which was 3 full brigades of Irishmen, more or less. The Dutch primarily had few companies, with the majority of them still holding strong to Dutch and only learning English during their time in service. Now, one of these Dutch soldiers from Michigan was Albertus van Ralta's son, Benjamin, and he served in the Company I of the 25th Michigan, one of those few Dutch companies that I told you about. So one famous story about Benjamin was during the Battle of Ultoy Creek in Georgia. During the battle, both the regimental and national color bearer of their regiment was shot down. The regiment, being forced to retreat after the battle, had to abandon their flags to the Confederates. This was a grave dishonor for soldiers of this period. Benjamin was so outraged by the fact that the rebels had taken their flags, single-handedly snuck into the rebel camp and retrieved both flags all by himself. The following day, the battle continued, and the rebels saw marching across the field the 25th Infantry with Benjamin carrying the U.S. flag, the flag that the rebels thought was still sitting back at camp. Now, Benjamin would continue to carry the flag for the remainder of the war and would continue carrying it during veterans events throughout in local parades. So like the nation as a whole, Dutch community was just as split as the outbreak of the Civil War, but they shared just as many stories of bravery as their Michigan cousins. So let's dive in a bit deeper into Iowa, the outbreak of the war. So a nationwide census was taken in 1860. Now what's fascinating to me about this is we have one of those rare instances where we have a complete demographic makeup of a country right before a huge event like the Civil War. So we can have a perfect example of what the nation looked like on the brink of one of its bloodiest conflicts. As a result of that, we learned a lot of interesting details about each individual state. For example, Iowa, being a relatively young state, only having been founded in 1846, entered the Union as a free state. And it would grow to a population of about 675,000 people by the year 1860, the majority of which worked as farmers, farm laborers, with a fledgling manufacturing industry growing in the eastern part of the state. Of that 675,000 residents, about 106,000 of them were immigrants. And of those 106,000, the Dutch made up 2.5%, about 2,600 people, mostly settled around Pella, Iowa. Despite early struggles of uniforming these men and equipping volunteers, Iowa heeded Abraham Lincoln's calls of 1861 and 1862 for more men, sending a total of 48 infantry regiments, including 1 African American unit, and 9 cavalry regiments and 4 light artillery batteries. Iowans primarily served throughout the war on the Western Theater, consisting of Missouri marching through Georgia, Tennessee, etc. However, some regiments served in the East, under General Sheridan in Virginia. They fought in some of the many war's most major battles, from Shiloh to Vicksburg and Atlanta and beyond. Now, we can't talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery. We've touched on it a bit, but Iowa as a whole, as I've said so far, is a free state, which means slavery would not be allowed on Iowan soil. But that doesn't mean Iowans were abolitionists. That's 2 different things. Iowa was a mix, much like the country as a whole, between avid abolitionists who operated stops along the Underground Railroad that helped escape slaves to freedom in Canada, and people who saw slavery as a normal part of life. Not something that they wanted to see in Iowa, but not something they really cared to do anything about. They see out something as like, it's an outdated system that'll die away on its own. Just keep it where it's at. As long as it doesn't come where we're at, we're fine. Now, the laws of Iowa kind of show this mixed attitude towards slavery. Governor Grimes, who's the governor prior to the American Civil War, in his inaugural address said, quote, "It makes the state of Iowa the only free child of the Missouri Compromise, to let the world know that she values the blessings that compromise has secured to her, and that she will never consent to become a party of the nationalization of slavery." Keyword being nationalization. Because at this time, Iowa had enacted black codes that restricted the entry of African Americans into the state without having proper proof of freedom from their masters in the South. And many Iowans, during the Civil War as well as up to the Civil War, continued to return escaped slaves for bounties, including members of the 1st Iowa Volunteer Infantry in one of the earliest campaigns in Missouri, where known to escaped slaves would flee to their camp, and we learned pretty quick that Iowans would pick them up and return them back to their masters. Now, this divide made its way into every facet of Iowan life. And much like the nation as a whole, one can't simply divide it just on those lines. To say the North was all abolitionists and the South was all slave owners is too big of a generalization. That being said, slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. So going off that, let's talk a little bit more about some of those men who served. We already touched on Marnus Reinsberger, who served with the 15th Iowa Volunteer Infantry. Here is portrayed a good image of what they would have been wearing during their battle at Shiloh. A side note here, you notice that they're wearing a different style hat than I am. They're actually wearing the model 1858 Hardy hat, so that would have been the regular issue infantry hat leading up to the Civil War, and was technically regulation as well during the Civil War, but many opted to wear this cap instead as it was a lighter weight, not as restrictive. But at the end of the day, it was up to the company officers to decide how their men would be dressed. So the 15th Iowa had both Marnus Reinsberger and a fellow Dutchman named Arie van Marl, also from Pella, Iowa. They both served until the end of the war. Marnus enlisted in January of 1862 at the age of 18, and Arie earlier in 1861, also at the age of 18. The 15th went on to serve in many famous engagements in the Western Theater, ranging from the Battle of Vicksburg alongside General Crocker's Iowa Brigade, and all the way to North Carolina by the war's end. Another Pella Dutchman and later Orange City resident was Joseph Voss. Here is a picture of him later in life when he was here in Orange City. Now, unlike his comrades from Pella, Joseph was in the 3rd Iowa Cavalry Regiment as pictured up there. He enlisted in May of 1861, less than a month after the war started, and saw service at the age of 23, where he served at the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas, which goes as follows. On the morning of March 7th, 1862, General Curtis directed Colonel Osterhaus to withdraw one brigade of his division from Little Sugar Creek defenses and head towards the Confederate force known to be nearby. He was accompanied by Colonel Bousset, who had a contingent of cavalry with him, which consisted of the 1st, 4th, and 5th Missouri Cav, as well as the 3rd Iowa Cavalry, and about 600 men total right there, as well as 3 guns with the 1st Missouri Flying Artillery. Around 1 o'clock, the Union advance party cleared a hamlet of woods, passed by a small cornfield, and entered a belt of trees. When Osterhaus emerged from the trees onto a man named Wiley Foster's farm, he came to an abrupt halt. Directly in front of him was McCullough's entire division. Not a scouting party, not a few cavalry scouts, it was McCullough's entire division. A massive formation, 6 regiments wide, with flags flying, weapons gleaming in the sun, and the Confederates had turned the corner a big mountain and were plodding eastward along Ford Road. Now, why does this matter? So, a little context here. This was completely circumnavigating the Union defenses at Little Sugar Creek. This was not only just a probing attack, this was a sign that the entire Confederate Army was beginning to outflank the Union forces. Now, Osterhaus was shocked by the sight of so many rebels. Like I said, this was not the modest-sized diversionary force he was showing up to expect to see. It appeared he had stumbled upon half of the Confederate army. Then he realized the importance of this situation. He realized this massive enemy formation had not only circumnavigated the Union defenses, but was heading towards the Army's supply train back at Elkhorn Tavern, only 2 miles to the east from their position. Notwithstanding my command was entirely inadequate to the overwhelming masses opposed to me, he reported, I could not hesitate in my course of action. Osterhaus directed Colonel Bousset of the cavalry to unlimber the 3 guns they had brought with them and fire on the tightly packed Confederates. The opening shots of Fleetown struck down dozens of rebel cavalrymen. Now it was McCullough's turn to be surprised. He believed the Union forces were still all tucked away in their defenses at Little Sugar Creek. He was not expecting an attack from his right bottom flank. After a few minutes of confusion in the Confederate ranks, McCullough sent McIntosh with 3,000 Confederate cavalry to wipe out the Union cavalry in the area. This became one of the Civil War's most colorful cavalry charge. With shrieks of Comanche war whoops and brandishing carbines, shotguns, pistols, sabers, bowie knives, hatchets, troopers of the 6th, 9th, 11th Texas Cavalry, 1st Texas Cavalry Brigade, and 1st Arkansas Cavalry, along with a contingent of Cherokee Native warriors, overwhelmed the small Union party of 600 men. Quote, in every direction I could see my comrades falling, recalled Henry Dysart of the 3rd Iowa Cavalry. Quote, her horses frenzied and riderless ran to and fro. Men and horses ran in a collision, crushing each other to the ground. Dismounted troopers ran in each direction. Officers tried to rally their men, but in vain. Order gave way to confusion. The scene baffles description, end quote. The Confederates scattered the Union cavalry this day and captured those 3 guns. But they were able to buy the Union time. And by the end of the following day, the Union would win a great victory at Pea Ridge, driving the Confederates further out of the Missouri area. Joseph would survive this engagement, receiving no wounds during the time, and would continue to serve, seeing action around Vicksburg. After Vicksburg, the Pellites parted ways, and the 3rd Cav traveled between Arkansas, Missouri, and the rest of that region. They were fighting guerrillas during that time, such as General Forrest's Confederate raiders at Memphis. Now we touched on another member who was part of forgot that slide. There's that. Hendrik van der Waal. Does anybody know who that is? We got anyone? Well, yeah, I kind of figured you guys would. Now, we've talked a lot about these Dutchmen who served in majority mixed regiments, such as the 3rd Iowa and the 15th Iowa. But the next one I'd like to talk about is Hendrik van der Waal, who served in Company G of the 33rd Iowa. This was one of those that was majority Dutch members. Now, Hendrik gained more fame later on here in Orange City as being one of the original surveyors of what would become the town of Orange City. But at this time, in October of 1862, he was a 22-year-old volunteer. Now, while his countrymen, as we talked about in the 15th Iowa, were laying siege to the fortress city of Vicksburg, Hendrik and the rest of the 33rd were stationed at Helena, Arkansas, along with other Union forces numbering about 4,000 men. They were ordered to prevent the fall of Helena at all costs and stop any Confederate relief effort to the fortress city of Vicksburg. In early July, a host of 7,600 Confederates, led by Lieutenant General Holmes, were at last on their way to relieve Vicksburg, which had been under siege by General Grant until May of that year. July 4th, 1863, the battle finally took place. A Sergeant John Morgan was there, a fellow Marion County resident, and he wrote an account in his diary of the battle. Quote, revel at 2 a.m. At 4, heard firing on the picket line. In 10 minutes, the big gun at Fort Curtis opened, and the signals previously arranged had begun. Every man in camp, able to stand, sprang to his feet and made haste to get ready for the fray. As we left camp, Morgan wrote, we could see the hills above town literally covered with Rebs. The Union forces were outnumbered nearly 2-1. But they met the Confederate army at Helena, I remember this time, with a fierce determination to win. On the morning about daylight on the 4th, the great slaughter began, wrote a private John Eckrote, another Marion County resident, to his mother the day after the battle. It was awful to see, and our soldiers suffered considerably, but we had gained a glorious victory on our part. I tell you, the 33rd fought valiantly. End quote. Despite the odds, the Union won a massive victory, and the next day the fortress city of Vicksburg fell, splitting the Confederacy in two, granting access to the Mississippi entirely in the hands of the Union. Now, Hendrick would continue to serve for the remainder of the war, participating in one of the last major sieges of the war, that of Mobile, Alabama, which fell only a few hours after General Lee surrendered in Virginia. Now, up to this point, I've talked a lot about the Dutch who fought on the northern side, that being because the majority of them did, a majority moved to what is now we would call the North. However, that wasn't to say that there weren't any who fought for the South. So, while there were few, the primary reason for these men's service was, in some cases, it was a passion for the cause, but in many cases, it was a community aspect. So, living in places like Richmond, Virginia, when the war broke out, led men like Jacob R. Polach to join the 1st Virginia Volunteer Infantry. So this was a common experience throughout the South at this time. You had immigrants who were new to the country, seeing the shifting politics within their new adopted home, and they had to make a choice. Do I pick up everything I've spent the last few years building and trying to create a life here? Or do I volunteer and I go serve in this cause that I may or may not believe in? Or do I stay and not serve? Which, if I run a business, that means everyone in the town's gonna say, that's the guy who didn't want to support the cause. He didn't go serve. I'm not gonna go over to him. Say a cobbler. I'm not gonna get shoes from this guy anymore. So many people, native Southerners as well as immigrants, found they had little to no choice besides volunteer or face ostracizement and basically excommunication from your own community. So Jacob, interestingly, was a graduate of the University of Leiden and settled in Richmond a year before the war. He showed his bravery during Pickett's charge shown here at Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863. When the regimental color bearer was shot down, Jacob ran forward and picked up the flag, carrying it into the forward during the entirety of the failed charge. He would be promoted to sergeant major for his actions, and he would serve until 1864, where enlistment would end and he settled down in Atlanta. Now, we've talked a lot about service, but not all the Dutch, as you notice from those numbers, served. So in Pella, a greatest example of this was Cornelis Jongewaard, who led 15 other families to the Oregon Territory to establish a new colony far from the war and far from the draft. Many of the Pella Dutch, as we touched on earlier, argued that them being Dutch citizens still disqualified them from being have to be drafted. Now, this gained many of them the defamation as copperheads, which was a term used to describe people who were seen as disloyal Northerners. Now, in response to this, the current governor, Kirkwood of the time, proclaimed all aliens residing in Iowa were to become citizens and thus eligible for the draft or were required to leave the state. Cornelis and his neighbors chose the latter option. A family acquaintance later wrote that, quote, being sincere believers in the admonition that ye who live by the sword shall die by the sword, they migrated during the war, end quote. They then began the 2,000-mile trek overland to the Oregon Territory. One story of note from this adventure was on July 13th, 1864. The caravan was attacked by a group of native warriors. The tribe in particular is unknown because the Dutch were unaware of what tribes were attacking them in that moment, so all I've been able to find is native warriors. So if any of you can find that, I would love to know. And during that time, they were able to steal several of the horses. A pursuit followed with some Dutchmen on horseback and others on foot, and a sharp fight broke out. One horse on which our Jongewaard was on was shot from underneath him, and another horse was wounded. One Native American was shot, but was retrieved by his comrades. And except for a few horses, the immigrants were able to retrieve a majority of them. 3 of the young men, Toynus Bergeraff, Baron ten Broek, and Isaac de Vries, headed for Deer Creek Station nearby. Their goal here was they were going to report this ambush to the local soldiers in the garrison. However, upon arriving at the fort, the soldiers mistook them for Confederate horse thieves. So now the Dutchmen were being pursued by U.S. cavalry troopers who were firing on them. Isaac had his horse shot from underneath him and managed to roll out from underneath at the last minute, avoiding being trampled by the U.S. cavalry. The other 2 were captured when they tried to cross a river and managed to explain to the cavalrymen that they were not, in fact, Confederate horse thieves, but they were Dutch immigrants. So, believing their story, they allowed them to leave on foot. Being given up for lost, Isaac managed to arrive at the wagon train just before they set out to leave the next morning. After this adventure, the Dutch had very few other major incidents leading up to their arrival in Oregon. However, many, once they reached Oregon, realized that the climate in the Oregon Territory was very different than that of Iowa, especially to the farming that they were used to. So, many of them decided to return the same way they came in 1866 after the war, knowing now the draft was over. Now then, we spent a lot of time me talking and you guys seeing all of this stuff up here. So I think it might be time that I actually let's look at this stuff. So you're probably wondering about some of the specific items that I'm wearing and equipment that I have shown here. Early in the war, Iowa troops were supposed to be equipped by the state. This led to very many difficulties for the state of Iowa because there was the financial crisis of 1858 that left Iowa pretty much penniless by the time of the outbreak of the war. This meant that many early volunteers received uniforms made by the great women of their hometowns. So you had some men who wrote that their pants were so deep that they could swim in them because they were just trying to make as many pants as they could, one size fit all. Some said they had to pull them up to over their breast and tie their belt at their chests in order to keep their pants up. Supplies were so sporadic at this time that the first 3 Iowan regiments were fully equipped in gray uniforms. Now, a little note about this is gray uniforms prior to the Civil War was a sign of a state-raised unit. So you'd have the blue and the gray as we think of today. Blue was considered more the color was used by the regular army. So for example, in the Mexican-American War, you'd have the regulars, being the men who have already been in the army when the war broke out and weren't new volunteers volunteering for a state regiment. They were wearing blue uniforms. Whereas many of the volunteers would have been issued, supposedly according to regulation, the gray uniforms provided by their home states. That's kind of where you get to the confusion early on the battles of the Civil War, as you had both sides taking to this. You have Michiganders, Iowans wearing gray because, well, I'm from an Iowa regiment, so naturally we've been equipped with gray uniforms. Obviously, friendly fire instances led to this being stopped by early 1862. So by that time, all Iowans were equipped by the federal government. As a result, you have the uniform that you see before you. What I'm wearing now would be about a mid to late war uniform. So not gray, for example. So we'll start with the basics. What I have shown here on the left is an example of an infantry private in a full dress uniform. Now, that was what they were issued at the beginning of the war and during the war as well, with the 9-button frock coat and that hardy hat that I said about earlier. Now, some regiments kept that full gear for the entirety of the war and became a marker of pride. Others chose not to. How the regulations worked is soldiers had to wear blue coat and the light blue trousers and the regulation hat. Now, that doesn't specify it has to be the frock coat and the regulation hardy hat. So it was really up to company officers to decide what those would be of the issued equipment. So on the right would be more commonly what would have been seen by later in the war. What I'm wearing right now, as I touched on a little bit earlier, is this would have been called a forage cap. Now, does anybody have any idea why this is so slooped like this? The French do have influence on this, but I'll get it ready. So it's called a foraging cap because the idea was you could use it for foraging. Think you're walking on a trail, you're marching, you're able to pick apples, drop them into your hat. You're able to steal eggs from a local farmer, put them in your hat. The idea being that this was a hat that not only looked smart, but could have a practical use as a basket on the field. Now, the other most common hat, especially for Western armies, was civilian-style bummer hats like this. This was much more popular in the Western armies, like the Army of the Tennessee, Army of the Cumberland, etc. Ooh, that really echoes. Okay. Whereas this was the other most common hat. And you saw more common this being worn in the Army of the Potomac versus the civilian-style hats, that being out east in Virginia. Now, moving on, we have the 4-button frock wool coat. Now, this would have been called the fatigue blouse. That meaning that it was intended to be used for fatigue duties such as road construction, corduroy bridges, etc., as well as all the other fatigue, like digging trenches, all of that stuff. However, this was found to be much more comfortable and maneuverable on the battlefield, so many soldiers continue to wear it all the time, some throwing their frock coats off to the wayside when not wanting them. So moving on, we'll talk a little bit about, so I also have the light blue trousers. So initially, there was another incident where the regular army would have wore dark blue trousers, another way of trying to distinguish those men who were regulars. They were in the army before the war started. That eventually changed when it was easier to manufacture this lighter color. So soldiers would have been issued a pair of these, and then for underwear, they would wear a pair of cotton drawers that would extend just below the knees. They would have been issued about 2 pairs of those, as well as 2 to 3 pairs of woolen socks. Their shoes would have been called brogans or Jefferson booties, as these would have been leather ankle boots that went up right about there. So that's the gist of the clothes I've got on. A little side note, when I say issued, I should say that the soldiers were given a stipend of money and were told to go to the sutler and purchase their clothing. Which meant if a soldier, for example, wanted a nicer quality one of these, they could buy it if they had some extra cash of their own. Or they could privately purchase their own uniforms. As long as it met regulation colors and cut, you could have a fancier, better, higher quality material. You saw that with some of the richer soldiers who were serving, and they had some more cash that they could throw around. Now, we've talked a lot about battles up to this point, but being a soldier wasn't just about battles. Majority of a soldier's time was spent training, marching, performing fatigue duties, cooking. So the government had to provide for all of these other important needs as well. By 1862, a soldier would have been issued the knapsack, which as you can see in the right of that picture there. This is kind of like a leather backpack that a soldier would carry all of his equipment in. That would be pretty much his entire life would have been carried in that knapsack. His army issue wool blanket, his rubberized blanket, his greatcoat, his shelter half, as well as any other personal items and any of that extra clothing. Now, moving on to that shelter half. By 1862, the Army did away with many of the larger tents that had to be transported by wagon. Instead, they opted for what was called the dog or shelter tent. Each soldier would have been given a half strip of canvas that had buttons on one side and buttonholes on the other. So what you would do is meet up with your comrade in arms, you would button your 2 halves together, giving you one small shelter. There are many ways you could set this up. Some would take branches and set them across from each other. Another popular way was to take the bayonet, attach it onto your rifled musket, stick it upright into the ground, and tie string between the trigger mechanism, run it across and tie it between your comrade's trigger, and stake it off like that. Little inconvenient if you had to pull it up on the fly. So, speaking of all that, before you I have an example of what a soldier would have been who has been on a few campaigns would have had. This is the bare bones of necessities. A note about soldiers during this time is once you're on the march for many miles at a time, you realize that that pack with small leather straps can really drag on you. And many soldiers had to make the mental debate in their head of what item do I throw away, what item do I keep, what item do I stash away, how do I do this? One account said that one man could follow behind an army and collect enough equipment to fully outfit 2 regiments. A little bit of an exaggeration, but the point was there, because men would choose random items like, oh, I'm going to keep my wool blanket, but I'm going to throw out my greatcoat. It's not going to be that cold. It's fine. Learn a little bit later. So we'll talk a little bit about what I got here. I have, very simple, a night hat, some woolen gloves, wool scarf, an extra civilian shirt. So side note about shirts, soldiers were issued woolen shirts, but they were absolutely hated. They were called hair shirts because they were so itchy. So soldiers would often write home asking for, please send like my favorite shirt from home. I do not want to wear this. Regulation allowed you to wear whatever shirt you wanted underneath, as long as you had the blues correct outside. Then for entertainment, writing was a huge part of it, so soldiers would have journals like this, or writing letters would be a huge part of it. You'd have books. Reading was a huge activity, such as a pocket testament, pipe, as well as some period wallet with some of the money and stuff that you would have carried, along with your matches. Cards was also a popular pastime. However, gambling was typically frowned upon throughout the Army. Depending on the officer, that was enforced. Now, a side note about hats. Now, depending on your service and depending on the company you're in, you would have had some kind of metallic marker designating what regiment or what type of soldier you were. So in the infantry, especially in the Western theater, many of the Iowans especially, theirs was pretty much left plain. They didn't have anything. In the East, they kept to the regulation and had a bugle, the brass bugle on the front. Many of the Iowans in the western part of the country, they didn't have those. However, artillery would have had cross cannons across. Cavalry, which I do not have one, would have had cross sabers. And engineers would have had the castle, distinguishing them as engineers. They would also have had their company letter or regimental number in brass put on as well. Now, vests like this were never issued to the soldiers. However, vests being a popular garment of the day, some soldiers did privately purchase vests in a military style, more for a fashion statement and that than it is an actual necessity item. I personally find doubling up in the middle of July with a wool vest and a wool coat isn't really my favorite thing to do, so I typically opt not to wear the vest. Now, the key here is all of this stuff needs to go on my person. So I'm going to demonstrate quick what that looks like to carry all of this stuff, minus my vest. So first things first, I look to my pockets. What items on this stack do I think I'll need access to relatively quick? Probably not my cards. On a march, I'm probably not going to be pulling these out and playing poker with the guys. So I'll stick those in a little poke sack here. I know I'll need my candle later, so I'll set that aside. My wallet, I can keep that because you never know what I might find. So I'll stick that in my upper pocket here. My timepiece, don't want that rolled away, I want to use that. Pocket knife in case I need that. Pipe, of course. Testament, hopefully that stops a bullet. This is a bit too big, so I'll set that here. This is the type of debates that soldiers would have had to have on, like, what items do I carry, what items do I not? I know I want my rubber blanket. In the 1840s, rubberization, like process, kind of that we would get rubber, started to be used. What this basically would be is a nice padding to protect you from the ground, from the moisture and stuff, and would help used as kind of like a poncho you could wrap it around yourself with. Now, some soldiers, I'll demonstrate here now. I think I'll set these here. I'm going to do what's called a blanket roll or horseshoe roll. Basically what I do is I roll up, let's see if I can do this not on the ground. There we go. Excuse me. Set this here. I will take this all extended out. The hope being I am given enough time to prepare before a battle starts for this to be done. Now, soldiers at the Battle of Shiloh didn't have such a luxury. Well, find the speaker. He did warn me about that. The soldiers at the Battle of Shiloh were completely unexpecting the first morning attack, so many of them were still sleeping in their tents. So a lot of them were shooting back at the Confederates, not even in their coats, just in their underwear. We laugh at it now, but think about it. They had to run back and reform lines, abandoning all of their lively possessions to the Rebs. So now I continue rolling this whole roll up. Now, may have just rolled the string up in it. Well, points being, this would then be taken up and tied together and carried around you like this. It's where you get the name horseshoe pack. Now this is a lot more comfortable than lugging that giant backpack around with you. Because this, it gets a little heavy on one shoulder, I'll take it off, I'll slide it over onto the other shoulder. You can still use your musket, not affecting that at all. Even if it's here, despite not being able to aim very well, if you're firing in a large group of men side by side, your aim is not really that important in that sense. So there's all that rolled up. Now, some soldiers would choose to roll their blanket this up in there as well. I found, and many others have as well, that it's better to slide that into the back, because if you're on a march and it starts raining, it's awfully nice to pull this out and put that on, as opposed to being stuck with, oh shoot, it's raining, I can't stop now and unroll that big roll of stuff to get this out. Now, we've touched on food a little bit already, as you can see in the picture of hardtack. That was one of the more commonly issued items of food. Army regulation officially stated that a soldier was to be issued 1 pound of meat, 1 pound of bread, and then coffee and sugar. Coffee replacing the whiskey ration in the 1830s. So what does that mean? What does 1 pound bread, 1 pound of meat actually look like in the field? No, you don't. That depends. So if soldiers were in a sedentary camp, say in the winter, where they were able to stay in one place for an extended period of time, the Army could provide for them a significantly larger portion of fresh bread. They would have Army bakers. General Hooker was famous for this, bringing actual bakers into the Army camp to have fresh bread daily for the soldiers. Another thing would have been fresh beef. They would herd cattle nearby in order to have fresh beef slaughtered daily for the men. This happened near the end of the war during some marches, but on average, a soldier for meat when on a march would have been issued salt pork. Now this is a pork that was so heavily drenched in salt that it would not spoil, and that would have been kept inside your haversack here. So in there, you would put all of that raw meat, heavily treated so it's not going to rot on you, but it is going to have a pungent smell after a while in the heat, as well as your 1 pound of bread ration, which in this time would have been hardtack. As its name implies, it's pretty hard. So this is, interestingly, I only just made this a day ago. So this is what's considered fresh. This would have been, a soldier would have been issued 3 days rations before a campaign of hardtack, meat, and coffee. Hardtack being made primarily of just water and flour, nothing else. It was said that the skies of Washington, D.C. were always black from the amount of bakers constantly churning out hardtack day in, day night for the soldiers. Now, there were different ways of eating hardtack. One common way was soldiers would take the butts of their rifles and bash it up in order to break it up. Another common way that also held another purpose was putting it into your coffee, letting it kind of break up and drinking a coffee, breadish broth kind of mixture. It also served another purpose. Because remember, these are being shipped all the way to Virginia, or even further in some cases, from depots as far away as St. Louis heading down to Atlanta, or vice versa, or somewhere along those lines, long distances. So sometimes these arrived full of maggots, covered in mold, or other items. So when a soldier dropped his hardtack into his coffee, not only did it kind of make it easy to eat, the maggots would rise to the surface of the coffee that could be swiped off, allowing the soldier to drink it. Or they would just eat them. Now, a book recommendation I have that talks more about this is John Billings' Hardtack and Coffee, the untold story of a soldier's life. And he really breaks down like what the day-to-day, not battles, not glorious things, stuff like that. Like what is a day-to-day? For example, silverware, plates. Soldier was not issued these things. You had to buy these yourself, or maybe a southern house was unlocked at a time. So he wrote that some soldiers, in order to clean their utensils, would take and repeatedly ram them into the dirt until the food and grime fell off, then shrugged their shoulders and tossed them back in their pack. Soldier to soldier was a bit different. So all of those items would then be packed away in here. Now, we talked about coffee ration. That is another huge thing. I would say the Civil War is the reason, in my opinion, that we are addicted to coffee. Oh, almost forgot about foraging. We touched on that a bit earlier. Like I said before, foraging was a huge part of supplying the armies, but early in the war, it was frowned upon. Early in the war, there was this idea that one quick battle, and we're going to end this war, and we're going to bring the South back into the nation. The last thing we want to do is anger the populace of the South too much, because we're going to be brothers again very soon, so we don't want to really piss them off. Well, the war ended up going a little bit longer than most people expected. So many more pragmatic generals realized the importance of foraging. So generals like General Sherman said that war is hell, and he was going to fight it as such. So he gave orders for his soldiers to forage liberally across this countryside of Georgia, and in quote, was going to make Georgia howl. So many of our Dutch veterans in the 15th Iowa would have participated in foraging parties, much like the one portrayed here. Coffee, probably one of my favorite subjects. Coffee became such a huge staple in the Union Army that this is an example of what dealing out your coffee ration might have looked like. So what happens is coffee was so coveted that soldiers would drink it before picket duty, during picket duty, after picket duty, on the march, after the march, every stop on the march. Soldiers would fall out of line to make a quick fire, boil some water, and make some coffee, run back to their column, and drink coffee while on the march. So important that what a quartermaster sergeant would do was throw out a rubber blanket like this with the white side up and lay out the amount of coffee per soldier for every man in the company. He would then take his company roster, turn around, and would have an aide with him who would point at a pile randomly and say, "Who will have this one?" And the company quartermaster would point down and say, "Will Minnick." Then Will would come forward and take that pile of coffee. This was because they were so concerned about favoritism and like, well, he got a little bit more coffee grains than he did, well, he got more than him. This was to clear that up. Now, sugar was also issued, but in a lot less quantities. So oftentimes soldiers would mix the sugar in with the coffee so that each spoonful would get a little bit of sugar in it. So that leads to the next point. This is pure grain coffee, not instant coffee that's going straight into the pot, making for a pretty strong cup of coffee. It was either issued to them in green form, green beans. It was either issued as well as roasted, or it was issued in the grain form. So that leads to my next point. Does anybody know what this was used for mostly? Shout it out if you know. That's a good one, yes. The other most common thing it was used for? Stirring something? Yeah. You want to be more specific, sir? It was used most commonly as a candlestick. John Billings wrote that the Army, while not doing the best at supplying every man with sufficient quantities of candles, did an excellent job of supplying each man with a fine quality metal candlestick. To simply stick the candle into the end of the socket and stick it in the ground next to him for reading and writing at night. The other use of it was a coffee masher, used to mash up those coffee beans I talked about earlier for rations. Now, obviously, the initial intent was for bayonet combat, but wasn't as prevalent. So we've already kind of touched on it a bit. I'm sure a lot of people are more interested in the guns that I have sitting over there. I tend to leave that to the end, so those people have to stay seated for the entirety of the talk. So we'll talk a bit about the military equipment and firearms of the soldiers. On the left here, I have an example of a fully decked out cavalryman, like Joseph Voss. Now, he wouldn't necessarily have worn that uniform in particular, but that is the ideal version of it. So let's begin with the ammunition. By the time of the American Civil War, a new invention in firearm technology came about, being the Minet-style bullet, or ball as it was called at the time. This had a greater accuracy than the round ball predecessor. How this would work is it had a hollow base in the center of the bullet. When the gun fired, the pressure would go into the back, expanding the lead into the rifling. This allowed for greater accuracy and allowed for the bullet to be slightly undersized, meaning you no longer had to put a patch behind the ball. Now, that sounds great and all, but the problem with the ballistics behind this is, without proper training, it's not going to be that effective. Most Civil War engagements happen between 150 and 200 yards. When you have a rifle like this, that the British used, like the Enfield over there, to great effect to up to 1,000 yards during the Crimean War less than a decade earlier. The problem comes down to training. Now, soldiers were primarily trained, as I talked about earlier with the 15th, in loading, firing, and drill. As a result, they weren't trained on the finer details of, yes, that is about 450 yards, so I should adjust by using my 300-yard sight, and they weren't taught that. Peacetime armies such as the British Army during the Crimean War had designated rifle schools in which they took men out to a range with marked distances where they would practice at each range for months at a time. By the end of this school, they were able to spot different distances and know from the top of their head, okay, I need to adjust my rifle to this sight in order to hit that target. The problem with the Civil War is the war is happening now. We need every able-bodied right this second. So that's the gist about this. I will demonstrate now how this rifled musket would have been loaded. Soldiers would have carried about 40 rounds of ammunition as cartridge forms in the pouch. They were typically issued 60 rounds of ammunition, so as you watched me scramble to put all my stuff in pockets, I would also have 20 additional rounds in separate packages that I would also have to find space for. So So how this would work is a soldier would be in shoulder arms. They would be given the order to load in 9 time, grab the rifle, place it firmly between the feet, remove cartridge from the bag, take their 2 front teeth, rip the cartridge open, and pour the powder in. Next, they would have to pull that bullet out of the paper and then place it in the muzzle. I'll actually pass this around so people can get an idea for what the weight of one is. And don't have to worry about powder. I use salt in that one, so it's just dummy cartridge. So next, now the bullet's in there, you would produce your ramrod, place the end on it, ram the bullet home. Now, some nervous soldiers would forget this step and end up firing their ramrod off in the middle of the battle, making it impossible to reload. Not entirely impossible, but not easy. Next, the rifle will be brought up to the hip, right above the cap pouch, where it will be brought into half-cock position. He would reach into what was called a cap box, which would carry musket caps. So these would have a self-contained pitrate explosive in them that would be placed on the end of the nipple. Then return to shoulder arms. In the middle of a battle, they would present, aim, and fire the gun. Return back to shoulder arms, repeat the process. It was said, and has yes been investigated, but some used to say that a good soldier could do that up to 3 times per minute. I found through subsequent research, in a battle situation, that was a lot to expect of someone. So you can get a more accurate 1 to 2 rate per shot per minute from especially when you have cannon fire and all the other things going on around you. So a little bit about what I have in front of you right now. This one here is the model 1863 Springfield rifled musket. It is the second version of the Springfield, the first being the 61 model. There's some very minute gun nerdy differences between the two, so I'm not going to go into detail unless you really want me to. So this was the standard American issued arm during the Civil War, the most issued for both sides, for at least the North, and it had sights that were up to 100, 200, and 300 yards. Now, the second most issued in the North and first most issued in the South was the British imported Enfield rifle. Now, as a whole, there wasn't too many huge differences between the Enfield and the Springfield in terms of ballistics and range. But one note that you get to see here that speaks to my point earlier about range, the British had ladder sights that could go up to 1,000 yards. Kind of shows a difference between the American rifle, how the British were expecting their soldiers to be able to aim and hit up to that distance. Now here as well I have what is called a Potsdam musket. This used to be a full stock musket and full length barrel when it first entered life, but has since been sold off at a military auction after the war and turned into what was called a barn gun, where a farmer would purchase a surplus Civil War era gun in the 1870s, chop it all down, and make it into a farm shotgun. But what this one would have started its life out as would have been a flintlock, smooth bore 69 caliber muzzleloader, imported from Germany that was originally used in the Napoleonic Wars, converted in the 1840s to a percussion lock, put into a storage shed somewhere in Prussia, and then when these American and Confederate contractors come seeking firearms, the Prussians saw a good opportunity to, well, we have all these guns we don't want anymore, we'll sell them to you. So many Iowan regiments were stuck using these over 50-year-old muskets. Now Joseph Voss was lucky. He was in the cavalry. So he was given a little something a lot nicer. The 3rd Iowa especially was issued these, and it was one of the more common, especially early in the war. This is the model 1859 Sharps rifle, Sharps carbine specifically. The key difference to the rifled musket was it was not a muzzleloader. Instead, a soldier would pull the hammer to half-cock and drop it at the base. It was called a falling block. So now the soldier would load a similar paper cartridge to the other. Instead, the bullet is now facing forward. This would have been slid straight into the gun. closed, there was a slight blade there that would cut the cartridge open, exposing the powder, then a cap placed on top, and then it's ready to fire. Significantly faster to reload on horseback than the rifled musket. Following that, cavalrymen would have been also issued one of either of these. We have the Model 1858 Remington Army model, or the Model 1860 Colt Army. Now, these are able to shoot up to 6 shots, which is a significant upgrade over some of those rifled muskets. Problem being, once you shoot through all those, you have to use a cartridge for each one and ram that down, as well as place new caps onto each cylinder. So more often than not, you'd fire your 6 shots and you're done with that gun for the battle. Some soldiers carried additional cylinders, but that wasn't terribly common. So, those are a few of the more common firearms that you would have seen during the Civil War. So, in conclusion, the Civil War was one of the most defining and divisive moments in our nation's history. And the Dutch experience during this conflict reflects that division. Like many other immigrants in the United States, they had to make a choice between sides. Some would pay the ultimate sacrifice for the new home, just like their American-born neighbors. I believe it is just as important today that we remember their stories and the important role immigrants play and still do play in making America what it is today. Are there any questions? Al will be going around with a mic. So if any of you have any questions, feel free to ask now.
Kaleb, I assume that you wouldn't be able to wash your jacket and pants very often.
So that's a great point, something that I almost included in the script, but I thought for time purposes I wouldn't. One major problem soldiers had was fleas and ticks. So in order to wash, one of the better ways was to find a river and hold it in the water and have the running water. But more often than not, to get the fleas, especially the fleas off, they would have to boil their uniforms. So they would have big mess pots for company cooks, and they would use those same mess pots that they use for cooking in to boil their uniforms to get all the fleas and stuff out. But you had no other choice. And I mean, I guess you kind of washed it out afterwards and it was fine, but it was a common issue, was laundering these clothes. In some cases, soldiers were so fed up for it that they ripped off all their clothes and went back to the company sutler and requested new clothing, saying that theirs was destroyed in some way. Typically being them throwing it in the fire themselves and being like, I need a fresh. And in that book by John Billings, he wrote about how soldiers would say they would last for maybe a day before the new set of fleas would reach into them from one of their bunkmates. So great question. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Wool jackets very warm, even in the summer, just in the summertime?
They can be warm. So that brings up a good point about why wool in the first place. Wool is a durable material. And think about it this way. If you're trying to run through the woods, especially in like the eastern part of the United States right now, and say you're wearing like polyester, that's going to catch on every bramble you come across, tear up. Wool is a good natural fiber. And depending on the thickness of the wool, it's quite breathable too during the summer. So oftentimes soldiers would have been issued wool uniforms that were maybe about 6 to 7 ounce weight wool. So it wasn't a super heavy duty wool. So making it more breathable and a durable material that was supposed to last hard campaigning. So in a short answer, yes.
I can talk. Was the medallion on your front ever an issue in a battle? Catching light?
So it's interesting to bring that up, but no, yes and no. So yes, I've had that before, the question of like, isn't that presenting a large target to you? And in a way it is, but you got to think about on the battlefield, you have all of this smoke and haze in front of you. Being able to see this gleaming item isn't as easy as you would think. Now, that being said, some soldiers did not wear them. For example, Berdan sharpshooters, they wore specifically green uniforms with rubber black buttons and did not have this. The idea being they were skirmishers who were supposed to get up closer to the enemy, fire and retreat and that kind of thing. So they didn't want to be seen. So in that sense they did. But on a whole, not too terribly much, because with the smoke and all of that stuff, you could barely see the blue marching in front of you, let alone the gray on the other side.
That was before smokeless cartridges.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes.
Reenactments, have you done quite a few of those?
I have, yeah. So one that I did recently was over in Fort Dodge, Iowa. They had a smaller reenactment. Then a few other ones are like Albert City will be coming up, and Mason City, Iowa are good Civil War reenactment spots.
Is that cannons and everything?
Depends on the event. Some events do have more, like Galesburg, Illinois. They do have a regiment of cavalry, so you'll have actual horse-on-horse fighting on the battlefield. It really just depends on the size of event. Some do have cannons as well, but yeah, it really depends because it's each who can show up to that event kind of thing.
And how's the food at the reenactments? Is it very...
You know, I don't find hardtack that bad, but I mean, when you don't have any taste, it doesn't have taste really, so it's like you can't say it tastes bad, if you know what I mean. And at the end of the day, it's just a strong cup of coffee. One trick I found is pouring some cold water on the top of it, kind of helps settle the grains. And then I just know don't drink the last swig of coffee, because that's going to be just all grains. But for the most part, it's not too terribly bad. One nice thing about doing this hobby is you get back to your warm bed and like actual 3 fixed meals, and you're kind of like, oh, I have a lot more appreciation for what I really have in life than when I spend a few days just eating hardtack and very salted pork.
So how do you load your guns when you're doing the reenactment? Do you put it?
So interestingly, I'll show you, I have a few reenacting cartridges here. These are pretty much exactly the same as the one that I passed around. The only difference being it does not have the bullet in it. So what I would do in a reenactment is I would take the gun and load it exactly the same as I showed you, except for when I get to this step. So I'll pour the powder, and typically, depends on the reenactment, but typically you drop the paper onto the side. So all that's been poured down there is the powder. We do not normally, for safety reasons, pull the ramrod out and ram, because similar to in the actual war, some new person can get a little jittery, forget to take it out, and then you do actually have a firearm being shot on the field. So for most battles, and some reenactments do require that ramrods are left in camp, just for men who have been really drilled in this, don't subconsciously pull their ramrod out and start doing that. So then all it is just powder in the end of the barrel. And then it fires. And then typically at the end of the battle, we retrace our steps picking up the pieces of paper behind us. Some groups do put the whole cartridge down in there, but that can lead to potential fire coming out from the burning of the paper, and depending on how close these mock engagements are happening, it's kind of a safety concern. So typically it's just empty powder, and people being smart enough to be like, okay, they're pointing, let's not get within like 10 yards of them, probably be safe.
More questions?
So how rare or valuable are those guns? Do you own them?
I do own them. This one is actually a reproduction, so this one's actually made in Japan. The Potsdam is an original, so I picked this one up auction, maybe like $200. They range in price depending on like, say for example, if this had not been cut down after the war and was still the full stock version, it would run for a little bit more money. But I enjoyed the story of like a gun's full service life from fighting Napoleon all the way to now fighting raccoons in a barn. The one above it is also an original. However, this one's got another unique story. So this is an original Enfield from the late 1860s. The difference being this is a made in Nepal version. So very unique because Nepal at this time had contracts to reproduce British-made guns. So this one isn't actually a muzzleloader at all. It is the Schneider Enfield conversion. So instead of being muzzleloader, it's an early breech loading rifle. What these were basically was the idea for breech loading kind of came into being by the end of the Civil War, and major European powers had the idea of like, well, we have all these nice guns, just chop the block off in the base and slap a piece at the end there, so we don't have to make whole new guns. So now this will take like an actual metal cartridge, but this one is from the Kingdom of Nepal from the 1870s. So instead of having like the sight numbers being in Arabic numerals, they're actually in Nepalese script. So if I ever want to live fire this, I'll have to have like a Google Translate of like, what is this number in relation to? And then the one below, these ones below this are all reproductions as well.
How hard do those guns kick when you shoot them compared to like a shotgun?
So it depends. So when I'm doing a reenactment, not hard at all, because you have nothing behind it, just powder uninhibitedly is exiting the barrel. When I'm live firing them, it all depends on the powder charge. Normally, it's about 60 grains of black powder used as the military load. So it's not too terribly bad. I have found it a little harder when I have shot a smoothbore with buck and ball, which is just one smaller undersized round ball and 3 smaller than that round balls. That provides significantly a kick to it compared. But compared to a shotgun, I would say a shotgun kicks a bit more. Like for when I've taken this sharps to the range and filled my pouch with a bunch of those specialized cartridges, one problem that I ran into was every time it cut, it may have cut at a different spot, so it would take up powder with it with each cut. Meaning my shots were never a consistent 60 grains each shot. So I'd have one that may have felt a little lighter of a kick, maybe because it was a little further out when I loaded it and it took more powder out with it when it cut. Or it felt a little heavier because I was able to get it further in and caught more of the powder. So it was a little like play around with it when it comes to muzzle loaders and black powder firearms. This one especially.
Anything else? Well, let's give Kaleb a round of applause. He did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
I stood on your hat. Sorry about that. Just have a few announcements to make yet. As a reminder, our next Nights at the Museum program will be held on Tuesday, August 18th, 2026 at 6:30 p.m. Our presenter will be Richard Rietzma, and he'll have the title, How Dark War Memories Influence the Lives of World War II Immigrants. So I think that'll be a very interesting topic as well. We'd also like to acknowledge our museum director, Lori Vanderswag, for her great work. I'm sure a lot of you have seen her articles in the Capital Democrat lately about different items within the museum that have a special interest or a special story. And so we do appreciate what Lori's done for us here. Also, another thing to remember is we're always happy to accept your donations. Imagine that. But there are donation containers scattered around the museum. Your gifts help us expand and continue our programs. And these items include operating expenses, maintenance, and developing new exhibits. And we really do appreciate your generosity. Also, if you appreciate the museum and our programming, we would like to offer you an opportunity to be more involved in the museum by volunteering. You can help us with a multitude of duties, and ask Lori or number one of the museum board members about how you may be able to use your talents to help us to continue and to improve the museum. All that being said, I'd like to thank Kaleb one more time and give him another round of applause. He deserves it. And thank you and good night.